Hi, everyone. Welcome back to episode 5 of Curated Careers. This is a free career series where professionals from across the art museum world come to talk about their career paths and insights into their industries and answer questions. So I'm here with Hallie Scott. Hallie, I'm so excited to have here. Hallie was my boss for 2 years at the Hammer Museum, and she's very important to me. So I'd like to introduce her. She is a museum educator and retired art historian living and working on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples in Los Angeles, California. Currently, she is the Associate Director of Academic Programs at the Hammer Museum. Hallie is committed to centering young people and fostering inclusive learning and exchange in museums. Her previous experience includes overseeing teen programs as the education specialist at the J. Paul Getty Museum, working as the education director at the Wassaic, did I say that right? Wassaic Project, a contemporary art center and residency in Dutchess County, New York, and teaching art history courses as a teaching fellow at Brooklyn College. She has a PhD in modern and contemporary art history from City University of New York Graduate Center, and wrote her dissertation on artists, architects, and dancers who developed experimental education initiatives in the 1960s and 70s. Oh, that's an impressive bio, Hallie. Welcome.
Thanks, Chloe.
Also, Dr. Scott. I always forget that. Dr. Scott.
It always feels weird to be called that, but thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
it's so nice to be here. I feel like we've been in dialogue for so many years about museum education and art history and the ways that they're entangled and not entangled. So yeah, I'm
Yeah.
happy to chat with
A,
you here.
a lot of my inspiration for starting this was those conversations when I worked at the Hammer. For a little background, I was a student educator. Hallie was our supervisor. There were about 15 of us. And we used to have these conversations in the office all the time. And I always learned so much. And that was a big inspiration for starting this. So I would love to start if you would be willing to share. Obviously, read your bio, but more about your education experience and general background before maybe we dive
Yeah.
into some specifics.
Yeah, sure. I think museum education is such an interesting field because so many of us have so many different backgrounds that bring us to this work. And mine was, I would say, like pretty meandering. Um, but to start, I think my parents might be tuning in at some point to
Oh,
this. So I want to say that my mom is retired now, but she's an artist and she was an art teacher and taught art at the college level, but also to kids at our house, in like very hippie style, I would say, art classes. And I was first part of them and then helped her with them. And I think um, art education, there are so many like teaching skills that are ingrained in me from that I didn't think about for years after and like took me time to acknowledge, but that in some ways was my start. Um, and I in college kind of like quickly gravitated towards art history, which I didn't have any like access or experience in before college. But art history was like a discipline where learning made a lot of sense to me, and I had always been interested in like literature, English, and history. But art history like made everything really concrete for me, and just like really made sense as like a learning method for me.
yeah.
So I studied art history, and thought that I wanted to curate, like I think a lot of people who study art history do. Um, and after college, I got an internship at MassMoCA, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, um, which was a great internship because they provided housing and gave us a small stipend.
Nice.
Um, and I was a curatorial internship, and it's a pretty small institution staff wise, and actually like a huge institution space wise.
Mm.
So I got a lot of experience in the small curatorial department, and also got to lead tours as kind of part of my work there. and liked leading tours, but yeah, felt more focused on the kind of curatorial side of things. And then got hired as a curatorial assistant and was there for about 2 years. And in that time felt like I really needed to go to grad school, because if I wanted to continue in curation, I would need at least a master's, and just felt like pressure to do the next thing, as I think a lot of people who are out of college do. Um, I'm taking like a really long view in telling this.
No, please. It's useful.
uh, so I ended up looking mostly at PhD programs because I wanted funding and I didn't want to like go into debt for grad school.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to CUNY Graduate Center, as you said in my bio, which is like a pretty phenomenal public school in New York with a really strong art history department, especially in modern and contemporary art, which was my kind of area of interest. And so I went to CUNY, and as part of my funding in my second year, I had a teaching fellowship at Brooklyn College, or actually for like most of my time, for the second through fifth year at CUNY, I had a teaching fellowship at Brooklyn College, and taught intro to art history classes, like cave painting to the present, to like 50 plus undergrads, and I had to teach 2 a semester, and it was like incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
I focused on like art from the 60s and 1960s and 70s, so like I was just like learning constantly with my students. But I really started to fall in love with teaching, and thinking about teaching art history in a way that was maybe more accessible than I had learned it, and also in a way that translated to people from other disciplines. The classes I was teaching were like required classes, so there were people from all different required gen ed classes, so people from all different disciplines. And yeah, I got really interested in kind of translating art history skills to people who might never take more art history, and also trying to kind of tailor my curriculum around museum visits, so that we could be spending time with art in person.
Yeah.
We were pretty close to the Brooklyn Museum, so I spent a ton of time at the Brooklyn
Sure.
Museum, which was really exciting. And yeah, through that process, I started to get really interested in museum education. And around the same time, as I was kind of progressing through my PhD program, I started to see the like kind of isolation of academic work and intellectual isolation, and the fact that I was like really being trained to write to only art historians and only art historians who were
Yeah.
kind of interested in the same topics that I was, and that felt limiting and frustrating and elitist. And yeah, teaching in museums seemed like such an exciting alternative to that. And I around the same time as I was kind of continuing through teaching at Brooklyn College, I had also been kind of missing work in Contemporary Art Center and missing my work that I had been doing at Mass MoCA, and the sense of community that is in kind of smaller museum spaces like that. And so I started to kind of volunteer and then do some programming for the Wassaic Project, which is this pretty small contemporary art center 2 hours north of New York City, that is just a really cool space, has a residency program and an amazing exhibition space that's in a former grain elevator.
Cool.
And they started to feel like they wanted to do more education programming in the community. And I, had this budding interest in museum education and said, oh, I'd love to like try that. And so they kind of had a little bit of money to pay me as I tried some like artist-led classes in the summertime for
Yeah.
kids in the community. And then realized there was an art teacher in the local public high school who was really hungry to bring artists and contemporary art into his class, and then ended up becoming their first education director, and kind of living part-time up there and part-time in the city, and developing education programming for them that was like very kind of community focused and
Mhm.
emerging from the needs of that community, which was like a former farming community that was somewhat economically depressed. And that was like kind of my training ground in museum education, it felt like. And I would like go to museums and say like, how did you do this? Like there's a
Yeah.
community center that wants to do a teen program. Like how do you do yours? How could we set it up? And
Yeah.
uh, kind of like learned in this very experimental hands-on way. Um, yeah, about museum education. And then by the time that I finished grad school, I felt like very certain that that was the path that I wanted to go into.
How
Yeah.
did you then translate? I feel like people, of course, you had the professional experience that kind of established you, but then you have that academic side. And I feel like people, when they see the academic PhD, they understand what you've been trained for. How did you maybe translate that and that curatorial side when applying to jobs in the future?
Yeah, it was like challenging and confusing, I would say. Um, I think that as I was finishing grad school, I was like, I had left the Wassaic Project to finish my dissertation, um, and started in my last year of applying to museum jobs, and like casting a wide net, both geographically and in terms of like types of jobs, because I really had no idea what what I was qualified for. Um, and there'd be some jobs that I thought I like feel very overqualified for this, but I wouldn't even get an interview. And I tried to like really talk about like focus on the Wassaic Project and focus on like teaching experience in my like cover letter and resume. Um, and um, and then like also like really emphasize my interest in leaving academia and moving into museums when I did get an interview.
Yeah.
And I think I even did that like in my cover letter. And I found that like the places that seemed interested in me were often like really major museums, which uh, I think maybe, yeah, I don't quite know why that was, but like I was a finalist for a job at the Met. Um, I actually had two interviews for a job at the job that I eventually got but didn't get in that time, at the Hammer Museum, um, and was also a finalist for a job at the Brooklyn Museum,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then um, got a job at the Getty Museum. And um, yeah, I think the Getty like has a huge and powerful education department, and maybe we're like more comfortable with um, the idea of someone with a PhD like translating into education than some other institutions were. But somebody gave me good advice, which was like, don't take most of your academic stuff off of your cover letter and resume, and just focus on like teaching experience that you've had. Or sorry, specifically off of your resume, because I had this like long academic CV that was
Sure.
like these conferences that I participated in and these publications, and
Sure.
somebody was like, just make like a 2-page resume that's just like teaching and anything that seems like museum education experience or close to it. And so at some point in the job
Great.
application process, I did that, and I think that was like key to really helping a lot.
Yeah. I find, and I think we had a lot of conversations about this, that I also had that, do I want to do curatorial? Do I want to do museum education? Do I want to get a PhD? Will a PhD help or hinder? And
Yeah.
I guess now when you maybe see applicants in your position now, or just speaking to people, if they have like a master's, how would you advise, or what do you notice when you're looking at those applications of maybe how to balance
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. It's so interesting because I've now hired um like 3 positions at the Hammer, and then been part of the
Mhm.
hired many student positions, but 3 like non-student positions, and been part of the hiring for many others. And there's like a huge for all of the jobs, there's a huge range of applicants.
Mhm.
Like even for our kind of department administrator job, there was someone with a PhD who applied. Um, and so, yeah, it's something I'm thinking about a lot in hiring. And it's always surprising to see like such a range of,
Mhm.
um, yeah, like educational backgrounds. I think the most important thing, or one of the most important things to me, is like to see that the person understands the role
Mhm.
and is talking about how they can translate their skills and experience to that role.
Mhm.
And so if someone with a PhD is really highlighting their what they did, as a PhD student or outside of that to um, learn about and do museum education work, and especially with whatever audience that this role is serving, like that looks great to me. But if they are more talking about their academic experience, it's hard for me to see how that would translate. So
Sure.
yeah, I think like signaling specifically that they really understand the role and that this is the role they really want to be in, and this is
Mhm.
the experience they can bring to bear on
Yeah.
the role. Yeah.
How do you advise, or what stands out to you when people are applying and they say, I'm excited by education? They feel like you sometimes just see this like broad, I love museums, I think it's important to share, but that's maybe it. What do you see as being maybe that like next step that actually really shows interest?
Yeah. Yeah. I sometimes I feel this is like something that I'll say frankly. Sometimes I feel um, I want more from like letters that spend a lot of time talking about how much they love museum and how much they love museums and how much they love museum education work, um, because it feels like in some ways it feels like that's fluff, um, and it reminds me of when I was teaching art history and students would write like throughout time
Yeah.
people have created paintings and um, they've evolved over time, and it's like this is like
Yeah.
let's narrow
Yeah.
this in a little
I mean,
bit.
obviously, we love art. We love museums.
Yes,
It's important for
yes,
others to love museums. And
yes, yeah. So yeah, I think like even if you haven't done any teaching in a museum,
Mhm.
and it depends on sort of like what level of role you're applying for, but if it's a more entry level role, even if you haven't had experiences in museums, if you can talk about the ways that the experience that you do have translates to the work that you would be doing, I think that's like always what I'm looking for. So maybe you have customer service experience and you've done tutoring and you've done some admin work and you're applying for a job that is like a tour coordinator position.
Mhm.
Like that is all an excellent experience to have for that job, no matter where it is, where it comes from. But yeah, making sure to talk about like how you have that experience and how you think it could translate to this
Yeah.
role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That broad, gosh, like we've talked about this, teaching art history myself. One of the greats, those wide sweeping statements, it applies in cover letters too. Now being on,
Yeah.
you know, one side of hiring, seeing those of like, I love art.
Yeah.
Go a little deeper.
Yeah.
So we've talked about it a little bit. Could you tell us more about your current role at the Hammer? Actually, maybe starting with before your
Yeah.
specialist as academic audiences, where that's where I met you, and then maybe how you
Yeah.
transitioned into your current role.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mentioned earlier that as I was looking for jobs, I like interviewed for this job at the Hammer, which was actually my dream job, which was specialist for university audiences. And that role oversees initiatives for students and especially student-centered initiatives at the Hammer, and then also works on collaborations with faculty and classes. And kind of the big programs that that position oversees are the student educator program that you mentioned, which is a group of usually 14 or 15 undergrad and grad UCLA students from diverse disciplines who train as tour guides and lead all of our tours at the Hammer, or just about all of our tours at the Hammer, to audiences of all ages. We also have a Hammer Student Association, which is a group of student staff and interns who come together to plan kind of large-scale events for students at the museum, which is really important. I think that we have events that are for and by students, and that students are kind of gaining other experiences in terms of learning about programming kind of beyond their job kind of focus or internship focus at the Hammer. And then we have Graphite, which is a student-run interdisciplinary arts journal that I always think of as like the way that students can really get curatorial and publication experience beyond like curatorial internships at the Hammer. I wish we had a space where students could curate exhibitions, that we could show student work, like a physical space. We don't, but we do have this great journal where students are kind of learn the process of creating a journal and then curate it. So yeah, those are some of our major student programs that the Specialist for University Audiences position overseas. And it was such a wonderful pleasure to have Chloe as a student educator when I came in that role. And just an amazing group of student educators in general. That's like such a wonderful part of working at the Hammer. Yeah. And just to say, before that, the job that, maybe I said this already, the job that I actually did get was at the Getty, and that was overseeing teen programs. And I will say I was there for like a year and 8 months. And then the Specialist for University Audiences position reopened at the Hammer. And the Getty had been feeling like very conservative. And I didn't feel very aligned with all of the goals of that institution. And so I kind of like jumped on the Hammer job and then got it in that second time. Yeah.
How did you land on college audiences as being, obviously seeming like you've worked with tons of different audiences? Obviously you taught college, but what made you stick with that?
Yeah, I think so. When I worked at Wassaic Project, the kind of focus of our programming ended up being on teens, although we did work with a lot of different audiences, and that was because there was like not a lot of opportunities for high school students in that area, and so it just made sense that they would be like a big focus of our programming. And contemporary art is so can be so like relevant and exciting for teens as they're like forming their identity and their own interests. So I had this teen experience, and then I had college experience. At the Getty, I focused on teens, and what I loved about the Hammer is it felt like the programs like HSA, Hammer Student Association, and Graphite took some of the like ideal principles of teen programming, which are to be really student-centered, to put like planning in the hands of a teen, and kind of applied them to college level. So it felt like a nice translation of my work with high schoolers. And I also just I missed working with college students, and I love that UCLA was a public school and has such a diverse range of students in like every sense of that word. And I think it's really important that the Hammer tries to find ways to kind of center students' ideas and students' voices, and I really wanted to be part of that work.
Yeah. And also it's not just like art people. Max was a neuroscience major, and he was one of my favorite people to tour with because he loved art, but he came from such a different perspective. And so that like diversity is not just in like demographics, but what they study. And it made for such, it really, from my perspective, broke down my like art historian right, and able
Yeah.
to look at art just every day, learning from those around me, which I think is also
Yeah.
such a benefit of that program.
Yeah. Yeah. We every year we are like trying desperately to recruit, yeah, a really disciplinarily diverse range of students, and especially students from like STEM,
Yeah,
because they bring really different perspectives, and because as a museum that is, I would say, like primarily a contemporary art museum, we often have um, work that is like dealing with so many different topics that it's so exciting to have all of these different student educators
yeah,
bringing their own perspectives and knowledge.
yeah.
Yeah,
So cool. So
yeah,
how now did you translate to
yeah,
your current role?
yeah. So I was the specialist for university audiences for, I think, just about 3 years. And some of those were pandemic years, so who, a lifetime. Um, and my wonderful supervisor, Teresa Soto, um, who was the associate director of academic programs, left last September 2021, for
Mhm.
a really amazing job at the Walters Museum of Art in Baltimore. And I should have looked up her title before this, but she is like the Ruth H. Martyr Director of Learning and
Learning
Community, maybe
engagement or something like that.
Learning and Engagement. And so we lost Teresa, who is our amazing kind of leader and supervisor. Um, and I took on a kind of interim role, filling in some of her duties, knowing that our leadership decided that that was helpful, knowing that the job filling process is
Yeah.
always incredibly lengthy and
Yeah.
slow, like shockingly so, I would say. So I was in this interim role, um, and then applied to um, be the new associate director. And I will say Teresa like really encouraged me to apply, which I really appreciated. The Hammer, I would say, yeah, at that point, I think the Hammer didn't have a strong history of hiring internally, or promoting, not hiring,
Mm-hmm.
promoting internally. And I feel very lucky to be part of like what seems like a wave where they've shifted
Mm-hmm.
to be doing a lot of internal hiring, which I think is very smart.
Yeah.
Um, and so I got hired to take on that role in March. So I was in this interim role from September to March, which is just like seems to be a normal museum timeline, but felt
Yeah.
like a really long time. And then in March, officially became the associate director of academic programs. And then at the end of July, um, hired my replacement for my former role, specialist for university audiences, who is the wonderful Kai Monet,
Yeah.
who has been like a longtime thought partner and friend for me, and I'm so thrilled to be working with her now.
Yeah.
But I think that's just like important to share, because it was like that seems like it is like sadly a normal timeline, and I
Mm-hmm.
really was doing two jobs for a long time, and
Yeah.
like also had wonderful colleagues, uh, who were also like chipping in so much. And
Yeah.
it was definitely like a very much a team effort, especially with
Yeah.
my colleague and family in K through 12 audiences, Tara Burns.
Yes.
But it is hard to be down a staff person, and I know that's like a state that a lot of departments continue to be in.
Yeah.
Um,
Can
yeah,
relate.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, yeah, in my current role, I oversee the academic programs department, which is what we call our education department at the
Mm-hmm.
Hammer, um, which I think is tricky because a lot of people don't know what academic programs means.
Yeah.
Um, but it is a long running tradition for us to call it academic programs. And we are a team of three full-time, well, four including myself, four
Mm-hmm.
full-time staff people, which is really amazing for us because we used to just be three full-time.
Yeah.
And one part-time staff person, and then I think 21 student staff, um,
Wow.
which is really yeah, really amazing. I was just counting the other day. 15 of those student staff are student educators, and then we have 3 graphite co-heads who lead the journal, and then an intern and a grad student assistant. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so maybe that's just 20. Anyway, yeah, so we're definitely a department that is like very much powered in part by part-time student staff who feel
Yeah.
like a kind of the heart of our department. And I feel like the biggest kind of part of my role is just supporting my team and supporting their work and advocating for it, like within the institution more broadly.
Yeah.
Um, and then I also spent a lot of time working on kind of deepening our partnerships and collaborations with UCLA. That's another big focus of my role. And then in some cases, like collaborating with specific faculty on curricular connections,
Mhm.
and I like specialized class visits. Um, and yeah, I think something I'm thinking about a lot is um, we tend to do so much with so many different types of audiences
Mhm.
at the Hammer, and I'm thinking about how to um, kind of make sure we have goals that we've all agreed on and that our work is like strategically aligned with those
Yeah.
goals, and we're not just doing as much as we possibly can until we're exhausted.
Yeah.
So I
That's,
haven't like totally figured out that picture, but that's
yeah.
something as someone like leading a department that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I'm learning now of when to say yes and when to say no and how to figure out
Yeah.
what that looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say, I should have said with the kind of to share the audience areas that we work on, we have like a strong focus on university students and faculty, another on like K through 12 students and teachers. We do programming for family and multi-generational audiences. And then we also think of like gallery visitors who are interested in learning and going on tours as another big population that we serve. So we're really doing a lot, working with a
Yes.
lot of different folks. Yeah.
Yes. Alzheimer's Association, UCLA Med
Yeah.
School. I mean, it's
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Oh, and I should add, I don't think we've mentioned this. The Hammer is UCLA's art museum, hence why
Yes.
UCLA is such a partner. Um,
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think
Important note. Yeah.
I'm so used to talking about it that I forget that
Yeah.
not everyone knows that. Um,
Yeah.
so, since you've worked with college students so much, and obviously that's the biggest audience, what do you share with people who are interested in going into museums generally? If you work with, other interns outside of academic programs, what do
Yeah.
you give them as that kind of like first steps advice?
Yeah. I think um, one of the things that I'm like always emphasizing with students is to try to just do as many informational interviews
Mhm.
as they can, just to like get a deeper understanding of museum work. And you're saying like people who are specifically interested in museums,
Museums,
right?
but
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
different.
Different
Maybe don't know
areas.
what area, or maybe they do, but
Yeah. Hmm.
generic museums. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So to like get a sense of what all the departments are in the
Mhm.
if you're working in a museum or you're at a university that's affiliated with a museum, um, I think like that in itself is kind of a puzzle. It's something I'm trying to make sure for interns they're getting like a full staff list and they're seeing an org chart and like
Mhm.
just like getting the lay of the land. And then trying to meet with people in different departments. And I think in general, museum folks are like pretty excited to talk to young people about the work that they do and are
Yeah.
always happy to do, or almost always happy to do informational interviews.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great sense to like understand different people's career, or a great way to understand different people's career paths and trajectories, and just to see like the breadth of work that happens
Yeah.
within a museum. So that's one thing. I think I'm always telling people to not go straight to grad school. I
Yeah.
think like it is easy to look around at people who are in museum jobs, like especially higher up museum jobs, and see that a lot of people have masters, sometimes some have PhDs, and to think, okay, I have to go to grad school to do this work.
Yeah.
And I think so helpful to try to work before going to grad school, whether or not it's in a museum, to be trying to get real work experience and getting just more of a sense of what you want in a workplace
Mm.
and what types of like administrative work that you enjoy or do not enjoy doing, like how you collaborate with colleagues, just to like get a sense. I think it's really hard, even in like internships that you might have in college or like work, like college jobs, it can be hard to get a sense of like what it's actually like to be full-time in a workplace.
Yeah.
And so I think that's like really important. And if you are interested in museum work and are trying to figure out like what opportunities to pursue, I think like looking for paid internships is also just like can be hard, but is really important
Yeah.
too. And there are some museums that offer like different sorts of paid internships, and I think it's getting better. I hope it's getting better. And I also think that there's like a growing consciousness that there are not a lot of like strong entry level positions
Yeah.
in museums, and I think that people are like more aware of that and are trying to think more carefully
Yeah.
about that. So yeah, to like look around for those types of opportunities that are compensated.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that was like very true for me and that I try to share with people is that I always like learned the most and got the most experience as like an emerging professional in like pretty small museums that were sort of off the beaten path. So like Mass MoCA, I had never been before, and I got an internship there, and it paid like a tiny stipend but gave housing.
Yeah.
And that was like amazing to have housing and to have a stipend.
Sure.
And because it was like a fairly small team, I like really got to do a lot as an intern, and also got
Everyone's
hired, I
doing
think, because it was a
everything.
small team. Yeah, everyone's doing everything. But you get to like see so much more because of that, or I got to see so much more because of that. And yeah, really got like hands-on experience in a way that I don't think I would have in a bigger institution.
Yeah.
And then also, yeah, got hired in a way that I don't think I would have in a bigger institution.
Yeah.
So, and then also similarly, like working at Wassaic Project, I did start volunteering. And that was like a time in grad school that I was like cobbling together tons of different nannying, like
Yeah.
teaching fellowship and volunteering at Wassaic Project, because I felt like I wanted to do it all, which was exhausting. But
Sure.
I did ultimately get compensated and actually got housing there too. So something to be said for rural arts institutions and providing housing. But actually, they also offer a paid, I think, at least housing, and I think paid internship program. So yeah, like hunting around for where the paid internships are, and also looking to smaller orgs where you might like be able to be more hands-on.
Mm-hmm. And not being scared of not having the big name. I think that's a thing that
Yes.
I heard a lot of, I need the big name
Yeah.
to get a step up. And sometimes I have found it doesn't hurt in getting an interview, but you don't always have, depending on the institution, because you're kind of siloed that
Yeah.
of experience.
Yeah. 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 That's very true. Yeah.
We've already touched on this, but I guess of noticing trends of moving forward.
Yeah.
Where do you see the state of museum ed today, and maybe where it's going?
Yeah. Yeah. I said, you shared some questions with me ahead of time, and I saw that one, and I was like, oh, this is really hard.
It's really hard,
It's
but
really
maybe just a
hard.
small part of like what you're noticing. Maybe
Yeah.
for people who have no clue what it looks
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, well, I'll say like I think in general, museums and museum education feels like it's still very much in a time of transition
Mm-hmm.
after pandemic, uh, and after like the Black Lives Matter risings of 2020. I think, yeah, I think um, it was feeling for a while like there was just tons of burnout and that a lot of people were leaving the field, and people were feeling really frustrated with their institutions and feeling like institutions had promised big changes and not, held up those promise or not. They
Yeah,
were just performative promises basically.
yeah,
And yeah, I witnessed a lot of people leaving, not just in museum education, but across museums, and feeling a lot of like hopelessness in terms of the future of museums. Um, and it feels now like we are like I would like to think moving into a new into a new phase.
yeah,
Um, I think it um, it feels like there's a lot of interest in, so I think to some extent there's like a return to normal, which is a scary phrase, but
yeah,
like we are now doing all in-person programming again, or just about all
yeah,
in-person programming again. Most museums are in that phase of like returning to the types of programming that were happening before pandemic. And I think that's exciting. People in the museum again, people in dialogue in museums again, learning in museums again. But there's also, I think we don't want to return um, without being like intentional about the work that we're
yeah,
doing and thinking about lessons from the past few years and how we can apply them. So one thing I'm like noticing is it feels like people in different museums, or like colleagues are trying to be, yeah, more intentional about their work and more collaborative,
mm,
with each other. And that it feels like a really nice trend. Like, for example, I've recently been in a meeting with other museums across LA that do teacher PDs. We were just talking about how we can make sure that we're not all trying to like hit teachers with the same thing, but like being intentional and listening to teachers about what they want
yeah,
and like working together to craft different PD experiences that aren't like overlapping or oversaturating.
yeah,
So things like that feel really exciting. And yeah, so I would like to think we're in this like new time of just being a little more intentional and a little less, what's the word, like scattered, and trying, yeah, just like trying to do as much as we possibly can with
yeah,
our work. Um, and I think it also feels like I would like to think that some of the conversations around DEI work in museums, um, are being like articulated in new
yeah.
ways and like actualized in some ways. And I have to say, like, I don't always feel hopeful
Mm,
about that. And it does feel
sure.
like there was a lot of performative promises that museums made that aren't um, being acted upon. But
Mhm.
there are like small areas of change that I'm seeing. I'm excited because we have a new full-time position that's funded by the Getty's pilot program. I'm going to get this title wrong, but the Getty has a program for emerging professionals that is funding 10 positions across LA to be paid full time 2-year positions for people
Oh,
who had Getty Moral undergraduate internships. That is really thinking intentionally about like this gap for emerging professionals. So you've had a great internship, but there aren't entry level jobs that have like meaningful work that you can do in museums. And these positions are kind of countering that problem. So we have a wonderful emerging professional who is working with us as an assistant educator at the Hammer, Rachel Regalado. And yeah, it's just such a privilege to have a new full-time position and a super smart person bringing a
It's
lot to
so
our
nice. I met her
programs.
briefly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's like one exciting kind of example of where I hope um, some of those DEI conversations are like coming to fruition in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thinking of that, I was wondering if you could share, especially in this, I don't want to say post pandemic, this reopening, what we've learned, advice or insights for people wanting to get into museum education, or maybe they're just starting. What advice, skills would you share?
Yeah. So I think like what I said about like trying to do informational interviews and talk to as many people as possible is a big part of it, and
Yeah.
like trying to talk to educators at different museums and hearing about their work and their paths. And again, like there's no one right path to this work, so that I think that's like feels overwhelming as an emerging person, but also like hopefully there's something positive about that. You can like take some different paths. I think if you are in college or grad school trying to find either like paid work that you can be doing in museum education departments, like again, I'm so lucky that we're at the Hammer where we can employ students to do things like student educator work. Um, or like finding other ways to build teaching and administrative skills. So like tutoring, like being part of an org, working at a like UCLA org or a university org where you're like learning facilitation skills. Like whenever I'm looking at applicants, I'm looking to see that you have teaching or tutoring or facilitation skills. So it doesn't have to be in a museum, but that you have like some experience teaching. And
Yeah.
so that's, or like being part of a program within your school that builds teaching skills. So that's one thing. And then I think something that is so tricky, it feels like, about entering museum education is that um, often employers are looking for both administrative skills, like can you do coordination work, can you run programs, and teaching skills. And there's not a lot of like emerging positions that have both of those
Yeah.
together. So if you're a student, I think, or if you yeah, or like just entering the field, trying to build in both of those areas, I think is really helpful. um, and knowing that you don't have to be building in museums, you just have to be like building skills in those two areas.
Yeah.
um yeah. um I think also there are a lot of good like resources for people who are interested in museum education, especially in LA where I am. MESC, Museum Educators of Southern California, is a really great kind of professional network of museum educators that has a lot of events that I think are especially geared towards emerging educators to like network and meet each other and gain a sense of like big ideas in the field. And then there are things like NEAE. Did I say that wrong?
I
NAEA?
always get it wrong. The
Correct?
National Association
Yeah.
of Arts Educators. So
Yes.
NAEA. Yeah.
Yes. NAEA. Uh, which you do have to pay to get into, but they have a conference and other they do have some like free events throughout the year that is kind of hearing about arts education broadly, but they also have some museum education focused events around
You get a
about like
journal
the work in the field. Yeah.
weekly,
um
monthly.
yeah, yeah. And then I also will shout out a journal that I was formerly on the
Yeah.
editorial board for, Viewfinder, which is kind of lightly sponsored by NAEA. That's an online journal that is a great place to write, like publish writing about your work in museum education if you're an educator, and also a great place to learn about work that different institutions and colleagues are doing. So resources like that, I think,
Yeah.
are really helpful. Yeah.
This is maybe an interesting topic, but I find people who say, okay, I had an internship, but how do I make the most out of it? And like, what are the, I guess, character traits that stand out?
Mm.
Like, how do you make yourself an employee intern that stands out, especially in education that's a public facing role? Um, you know, I hear people say, like, what stands out besides just doing your work?
That's so interesting. It's like a tricky question because I think um, there is such a bad tendency in museums and nonprofit work to feel like you have to overperform beyond
Yeah.
your job duties and like give more time,
Yeah.
give more energy than is required. And I don't want to encourage that. And I think
Yeah.
that's really problematic about our work.
Yeah.
Um, but I think just, yeah, let's see. Let me think about that for a minute. I think just like being interested and engaged in
Mm.
what you're doing and also like always feeling comfortable asking for like clarification or support if you aren't sure
Mm.
what you're doing. Like those to me are the strong, like what makes us strong, like especially emerging
Mhm.
um staff person is like you're excited to learn and you're excited to engage in conversations about the work and you're also like ready to admit when you don't understand something or when you need more support um, and ready to like be in dialogue about what aspects of your job are making sense to you and what are
Yeah.
feeling overwhelming so I think like that type of dialogue is really important to see um, yeah, yeah,
I agree.
that's what I'll say.
I agree.
Yeah.
I want to open it up now if anybody's watching has questions. But I also had some that were submitted. Um, so I'll share the first one that came in
Mhm.
is how do you stay versed on the latest developments in education? And I'll add
Mhm.
to that maybe a second question of how do you do it when you're trying to do everything else?
Yeah. I think like some of the things I already said, like Mask, NIEA, Viewfinder, um, the Journal of the Journal of Museum Ed. I'm doing really badly with my titles
It's okay.
right now. um, but like knowing what kind of like publications and forums there are and trying to stay tuned to what they're doing. And then like for me, like the most rewarding way to kind of like keep abreast of what's happening in the field is to like be in dialogue with my colleagues.
Mhm.
And so like trying to find ways to be meeting with people at other museums and hearing about what they're doing. Um, and yeah, being part of or listening in on dialogues that seem interesting to me that are happening in like broader forums.
Mhm.
Um, that's kind of like a vague answer, but yeah, I think
Yeah.
like hearing from colleagues and hearing what colleagues are up to, and um, even just like most importantly, being in dialogue with colleagues of the different museums that are right around you or museums that you see as like doing parallel work to
Yeah.
you. I think that's like the most rewarding way to think about like what are things we're all sort of like dealing with together, what are issues that we're thinking about. Uh, and finding forums for bringing like different people who are working on the same issues together. I was like very lucky to be a part of a teen programmers network in LA that is kind of like in a quiet phase right now, but that was just different people from museums and nonprofits talking about the teen programming work that they were doing.
Yeah.
That's like so that type of like colleague network is so valuable.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, to do it like on top of everything else, I think like trying to be intentional and only joining conversations that feel relevant to you and your work I will say that I went through a phase where I felt like I needed to be like really involved in the field beyond my job, and I
Mhm.
joined the the Museum Educators of Southern California board, and then also at the same time joined the Viewfinder editorial board. And uh, that there was like, I think 2 years where I was doing both at once.
Uh,
And then my MESC tenure was over, so I stepped down from that. And then after I got this promotion at the Hammer, I stepped down from Viewfinder because that's all unpaid work.
yeah,
And it is like really exciting learning work and really exciting collaborative work, but you can very easily be on like a treadmill of doing unpaid work for the field and um, feeling really burnt out about
yeah,
it. And so um, I wish I had advised myself against doing both of those things at once. I think
yeah,
they're both really valuable, but it was just too much to do. And I feel good to have sort of like said, I need to step away from these things for now
yeah.
and just like focus on my job. Yeah.
No, that's a great answer. Also, if I can add, we talked about informational interviews. I'm learning
Yeah.
I'm still technically in that like emerging phase. That networking, as you were saying, talking to colleagues, think of that as networking, informational interviews. That doesn't stop.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Because you're constantly learning. And I don't think
Yeah.
that's emphasized enough of like
Yeah.
putting yourself out there is not just getting to that first job. It's for getting
Yeah.
those insights.
Yeah, and like it's so yeah, I think it is a wonderful thing about museum education is that we're all eager to talk about our work with each other and to like be in dialogue with each other. And it's so valuable to say, I'm thinking about shifting this program this way, and I know that this other museum is doing that or is thinking about that. I'm gonna just like reach out to this person
Yeah.
and see if they'll talk. And they'll always talk, and it's always rewarding to
I
have
called you
those
on
conversations.
Friday about it.
Yes, exactly,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Speaking of that, how
yeah.
somebody asked, how do you create programs that aren't just copying other institutions? Like, how do
Yeah.
you start that dialogue?
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was a really interesting question because like I've never thought about the I've never thought about like a copying problem before, but I as I was like looking at that question, I was thinking about like a few things. One is I think it's super important to understand different models,
Mm-hmm.
like different existing models of the types of programming that you're thinking about. So anytime I'm thinking about doing a new program, I'm wanting to talk to different institutions who are doing that, like working with that type of audience or in that type of way to hear what they do. And I think like having an understanding of those models is so important to make a strong program.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't think about that as copy. I think about it just as like getting a sense of the models that are out there.
Yeah.
Um, and then, but I think it's also important not to be offering the same programming to the same audience as other institutions near you. Um, and I think um, that's like a place where, yeah, copying isn't quite like the word that I would use, but I think, yeah, it's important to like not be offering something that's already being offered just because then you're just like overloading the audience
Right.
and like doing more work yourself than you should, you know, than you will want to be doing. So I think in that sense, like getting a sense of what's out there locally and what audiences aren't being served or what types of programming isn't being offered and how you can offer that programming. And then I also am always trying to think about programming as collaboratively as possible. So we're working with teachers at the Hammer, and we often do that with VAPA, which is the Visual Arts and Performing Arts Education Program at UCLA, who's also working with teachers. And it's such a nice like partnership that we can like do teacher PDs together
Yeah.
instead of like them offering teacher PDs and us offering teacher
Right.
PDs. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I'm also thinking of that of like, how do you keep your finger on the pulse? And I think maybe to add on that, like the latest developments is also just keeping an eye on
Yeah.
other institutions around you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this
I
is a
think just to add like
yeah,
one more thing to that, I think it's like so important in programming to know that the audience that you're trying to program for wants the programs that you're doing. So to think about the audience themselves as like a collaborator in the program and trying to find ways to like learn from them about what they want. And often museums are just like putting out stuff without like understanding what the audience wants. And I think that's it's hard to do the work of like figuring out who the audience is and understanding what it wants, but that's to me like always a programming goal, something to
yeah.
strive for. Yeah.
So this is a hard one.
Yeah.
Someone asked, how do you balance knowing you need to do more to increase DEIA,
Mm,
etc., especially when there are calls for action? And I'll add in how you mentioned feeling like it was
mhm.
really performative, but also knowing things move slow behind the scenes if you're doing so much and we're often understaffed. How do
Yeah.
you do that? And I know you're really lucky being at the Hammer, where there's already maybe like a base that's a little bit more ahead of some institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I'm part of our diversity and inclusion group steering committee at the Hammer. And we just had a conversation. We're like, I would say like very much in a phase of like sort of what our consultant told us was a productive pause, like
Mm.
um, reevaluating what we want to be focusing on, and not yeah, kind of like pausing and sort of like reconsolidating after a lot of staff have left and things have shifted, um, and new staff have come on. But the point that I was trying to make is we were talking about this idea that like DEI work is everybody should be everybody's responsibility at the museum, and thinking about ways that it's like um, already part of the work that we're doing ourselves, like as individuals and as departments, and how we can like continue to strengthen in those areas. Um, and I like that way of thinking, and I'll say like that's particularly like I think at many museums, there's a tendency to be like, oh, we have this diversity and inclusion group, they're doing this work. Um, and the rest of us are moving along. And I think trying to like reframe it and think like this is part of all of our work. How is it already happening within the work that we're doing? And how can we like do it even better as we're just trying to do the work that we're doing, as well as possible. So that is like a helpful frame for me to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think it has to be something extra that you're doing, and I don't think it has to be something that you're working hard to do for your institution. If this is so tricky, I think like your leadership and your institution has to want it. And I think there's like a tendency to be trying to like push it without reception from leadership, or leadership might say they want it but aren't acting on that. So it like to reframe and think this is part of our like values as a department. How is this part of our values as a department? How is this part of the work that we're already doing, and how can we do it
Yeah.
even better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe this is another question, but how do you just how do you make that maybe visible? Or what do you do when there are like outside calls that this isn't it doesn't seem like it's being done because things behind the scenes are slow. Like, do you
Yeah.
feel like that's just okay, we just keep on doing the internal work and know that it's slowly being integrated without needing to put it out there? Or maybe just I know that's like a tricky thing of how do you view that yourself?
Yeah, I think I think whenever I'm talking to colleagues about the work that we're doing in our department, it feels like natural to emphasize um, like how we are trying to work, how we're thinking about inclusion in the work that we do, or how we're thinking about accessibility in the work that we do. Um, etc. And so like having that be part of the conversation that
Mm.
I'm having with colleagues in other departments, um, I think is like part of it. I think um, let's see. Um, I'm like thinking about this both in terms of academic programs and also in terms of like our diversity and inclusion group at the
Yeah.
Hammer. I think gee, like in terms of like projecting outward to the world,
Mm.
like on social media or whatever, I think it's like not helpful to talk about the DEI work that we're doing as an institution
Yep.
unless we're like really, really doing it.
Yeah.
So that's like one thing that I'll say.
Yeah.
I think it's much better to like quietly try to do the work and not uh like publicly tout it or yeah.
Yeah.
Um but I think yeah, again, like when I'm talking to colleagues, um I think just kind of like naturally emphasizing how it comes up in the work that we're doing and yeah. I think it depends on also like what types of mandates people have at different institutions.
Sure.
Um, yeah.
Can think
Does
of
that answer your question?
yeah.
Or
No, it does.
yeah,
Yeah, and I can think of a few institutions that, as we mentioned, very performative, and some
yeah,
we are doing the work, and definitely some that are not.
yeah.
I had a question that came in about how do you level up in this field, and I think this connects to
Mm,
it's really hard to find entry level positions that you're actually gaining meaningful experience. So if you're trying
yeah,
to level up to get that experience, how do you advise that?
yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sighing because like I've like heard supervisors say things like you have to be like doing like working above your job title in order to get a promotion. I think that's like pretty horrible work
Yeah.
practice. Um, I think that yeah, and I think it's important to like advocate for the value of your labor and not take on like extra work in that way. Um, I think one thing is I think it's important to like talk to your supervisor about your interest in next steps and like
Mm.
what your professional development goals are. And as a supervisor, it's important to like listen and to support that work or like those goals.
Mm.
So I think yeah, those are like two things that I think are really important. Um, I think it's also like um, often in museum education, at least, we are it depends. I think it depends on the museum, but like often you are leveling up by leaving your institution and moving to a different institution. And I think that's problematic. I think a lot of museums don't do a good job of creating like pipelines and professional development for their staff. But I think it's um, maybe like help personally helpful to be realistic
Yeah.
about that. Um, um, yeah, that's what I think, but I do think it's the most important to like identify how you want to develop professionally in the role that you're in and talk to your supervisor about that and like hold them accountable for helping you with that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Let's say you're not getting that and you need to
yeah.
leave, but you're not sure what you need to know. What would you advise of like skills or places to seek learning those skills? Because you can't move up until you get those.
I mean, one thing is I think it's like always worth just applying to
Mm-hmm.
things and seeing like don't worry about what skills you think you need for your next step.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, like apply for things, like try to get interviews and you'll learn in the process
Mm-hmm.
about what you need. Um, and also be having informational interviews as well, because that's really a place that you'll learn in the process.
Mm.
I think that we aren't in a field of hard skills. We're in a field of soft
Yeah.
skills, and so I think I think there's something good about that in terms of like leveling up, in that you can, in some ways, maybe it's easier to build soft skills than hard skills, or like to figure out what you might need and then practice them. Like um, uh, I'm trying to think of an example, but I'm not quite sure. But like, think like if you feel like you need more stronger like public speaking skills in terms of how you talk about your work, like you can probably find opportunities to do that more in the job that you have, even if it's just like talking to colleagues about the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Um, things like that. I think like being part of, this is tricky because it's often extra work, but if your institution has like cross-departmental groups that you
Mm.
can be part of that might be doing specific projects within the institution, and hopefully you can be part of those without taking on too much responsibility outside of your, or without taking any responsibility outside of your job. But I think those types of things can help you build skills that you might not get in your everyday job. I also think joining things like like the MESC board, um, which is a volunteer thing, but that is like a collaborative board that plans programs for museum educators and
Mhm.
plans an annual institute like symposium for museum educators. And
Yeah.
like being part of that planning work and that organizing work is like a really great skill builder if you aren't getting that types of skill in your job. I
Absolutely.
wish that we had more like leadership training in our field. It feels like we
Yeah.
basically have none, and I'm frustrated by that, and I don't have any like solution for it. But I think if you can find like leadership trainings or certain management trainings that might be helpful, um, that can be really helpful as well. Yeah.
It's a good one. Um, we've gone over time, but this is so exciting. I could talk to you all day, but I want to, if anyone else has any other questions, I have one last question, so we'll see if anyone else joins in. Um, you mentioned this earlier, but figuring out what you're qualified for. How did you maybe figure out that, or what you advise? Just
Yeah.
applying,
Yeah.
seeing where you get interviews, but maybe
Yeah.
how do you figure out, do that like internal work of, I guess, figuring out maybe if expectations are too high, too low.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. I think, I mean, I really did it by applying. Um, and yeah, it probably wasn't like the most efficient method, because I spent a lot of time applying for jobs that I never heard anything back
Same.
from. Um, I think like the more savvy way to do it is to try to ask for informational interviews before you apply for things. I
Mhm.
will say like I got, I said I like applied for this job at the Hammer and didn't get it, and then worked at the Getty and then reapplied and got it. And before I reapplied, I asked Teresa, who was the former associate director of academic programs, for a coffee,
Mhm.
just so I could like talk to her about my interest in the job and ask her if she thought I would be a good fit. And she was like really generous and willing to do that. And I think
Mhm.
you will often find that that's the case. People will be willing to do that. So I think um, it's hard to like cold call people, but if you can like find someone at the institution that you might have some connection to, or that
Mhm.
like let people know you're interested in this job and see if they have some connection to it. Like I'm always telling students that we work with, like if you're interested in a job at a museum, let us know and we can tell you if we know someone there.
Sure.
So I think like, yeah, asking people about it, seeing if they think you are qualified, asking if they know anybody that they can connect you to, and trying to do an
Mhm.
informational interview first. I think that's probably like the best
Yeah.
path. Yeah.
One follow-up question. How do
Hmm.
you do informational interviews effectively? Because I feel like sometimes people don't know how to do them. They,
Yeah.
besides asking them about their current roles, you know, asking to learn, when you're trying to get that next step, you maybe don't know how to do it. What have you found
Yeah.
people doing interviews with you to be effective?
Yeah. This is a nice question. It's also like we have interns at the Hammer who like kind of organize and do informational interviews with other staff, and
Yeah.
our amazing intern Camille last year like put together a list of great questions for informational interviews. So I think it's really helpful to prepare questions ahead of time, and I think it's really helpful to do some research on who the person is and what they do before, and have some specific questions ready for them. I think it's always helpful to start out by like either with like what's your trajectory to this job. Let me rephrase that. I think it's really helpful to start out with two questions. Like the one is like, what was your trajectory to this job? And then the two is like, what do you do? What does your job look like?
Mm-hmm.
And that those are like the best general informational interview questions. And then to have more specific questions, maybe about the work that they're doing, um, that are like thinking about specific programs or thinking about things that it might be helpful for you to learn about specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always excited when somebody is like, I know Hammer has, for example, a student educator program. I'd love to hear more about how that worked. Um, it makes me feel like they're like genuinely interested in like the work that we're doing at the Hammer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think just like having some research ahead of time and some questions ahead of time. I think if you're doing an informational interview that's about like, I'm interested in this job, like I think it's helpful to come in with specific questions about that job. Like, um, I'm interested in this like gallery educator position at MoCA. I have done some research on what types of programs the gallery educators work on. I have some questions about those programs, and I also want to ask about like what you're looking for in hiring a gallery educator. So, um, yeah, like specific questions like that that are you've spent a little time thinking about ahead of time, I think are really helpful.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I think I've learned from just doing them a lot, like how to even target them even more, to be
Yeah.
so helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I also feel like it's always helpful to share your questions with someone else ahead of time, just to be like, does this seem reasonable?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Hallie, I could talk to you for hours about this. I find it so useful. And also, I find, even though we were talking a lot about edge being also, because you've worked with college students, like, I should also add, you worked with the interns that were across all departments. So it's super
Yeah.
applicable. Um, Again, I could just keep going and going, but I want to respect your time. So I want to say thank you for joining us. I just know it was even super helpful for me in thinking about moving forward. So thank you. I will be putting this. This will be going on YouTube for anyone to watch. Um, Keep adding questions. I go through and add them, and if any of them I get stuck on, I probably will be asking Hallie because I
Mm.
go to her about questions all the time. So thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of
Thanks,
your
Chloe.
Sunday.
It's been such a pleasure. So
Thank
nice
you.
to chat.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.